Perhaps I should, maybe I should start with just a conceptual question. First, the informational question. Did you mean that the Israelis are trying to hide the demographic information about the balance of immigration and immigration?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Yes.
But
if
the question, yeah. But I mean, if you think so, I'm sure you looked into it. Because the statistical yearbook used to put the balance, publish the balance, and so on.
They still do, but it's incomplete, it's false, and it's camouflaged in a variety
by the
of ways.
definitions.
It's very complicated. I have all kinds of tricks to get around it, but it's very hard.
Now, why? I mean, when I read the paper, this latter part about the Jewish history is really very profound, and I'm sure many in the region will read it and be interested in it, and for various reasons. I think for the Israelis, it will be scary, and there are rising voices that the U.S. and if it wouldn't be pushed by Israeli foreign policy, is the only hope actually for saving Israel of itself. But why do you say that the Iron Wall has been abandoned? I mean, what's the argument? Isn't Israel? Is it because of the latter part of Jabotinsky that the rationality of the force is abandoned? That's yes, the concept, but not the policies.
No, the policy. The policy of the Iron Wall.
You want to pay attention to the mic here?
I'm sorry if I've been ignoring you. Don't displace the rich intellectual and theoretical content of the Iron Wall to one little piece of the idea.
Which is the use of force.
Which is the use of force. Well, no, because they have the use of force pedagogically.
Yeah.
That's what's been abandoned. The use of force pedagogically, to teach something, to accomplish something that leads to something else. That was the whole point of the Iron Wall. We are using it not for its own sake, not because, or not as an explosive outlet for our feelings or for a short-term accomplishment of a security objective. We are using it so that there'll be a chain of events, a chain of consequences that we'll be able to exploit to solve our political problems. That's what's been abandoned, the pedagogical use of force, and that's the crucial element of the Iron Wall. To think of the Iron Wall as Israeli power, is reliance on power, is the simplistic way that Netanyahu and other rhetoricians on the right use it in order to try to justify a completely anti-Jabotinskian, unsophisticated notion, as if the world hasn't changed at all. They're still in the first stage of the Iron Wall. We have to, in fact, they still say we have to eliminate even the gleam of hope in the Arab world that they can destroy us. You'll still find Israelis saying that. But they don't then follow it up by saying, and once we do eliminate that gleam, then we'll do that. They don't even say that anymore. So the rhetoric is, at the very least, to go all the way back to the beginning of the Iron Wall, where you're still trying to implement that first stage. But what I note is that those people, even if you question them privately, and if you say, well, what happens after that? I have many quotes in my paper from Ephraim Halevi or others who were in charge of the Shin Bet, or Ephraim Inbar, people like that. There is no difference. It's going to be an endless war, period. And that's what it's going to be. That is the one prediction that you can get out of the extreme right, which is not consistent with the Iron Wall strategy. It's consistent with the use of force, but that's not the same thing. That's the sense in which I'm talking about the abandonment of the Iron Wall, the abandonment of the pedagogical use of force.
I want to ask you about the viability of the two-state solution. You said you thought it could still be pulled off if American foreign policy changed. But can it be pulled off without Hamas buying in to some extent?
No. I didn't say that.
Well, how can they?
Well, because I think Hamas is perfectly ready to accept a 20 to 30 year ceasefire that's based on the creation of a Palestinian state, and then we'll see. And to me, that's the best Zionism can get right now.
There would still be rockets coming over. And
No,
stuff like
no, no,
that.
no, no.
You
No,
don't-
Hamas is very capable of enforcing a ceasefire. It has in the past. In fact, that's the problem from Israel's point of view, many Israelis, is they haven't liked the fact that they have this choice between peace, or a quiet border, but an agreement with Hamas, or no agreement with Hamas, but no quiet. They just haven't wanted it. They're not willing to accept the terms, which is we don't abandon the conflict, we just have an armistice for another 30 or 40 years, and we'll see. And basically what Hamas thinks is the same, is a version of what the Islamist movement and Muslim Brothers think across the Middle East, which is we don't have to bring these regimes down by brute force. We can't anyway. We tried and it didn't work. By revolution, by coup d'etat, by assassination. But ultimately they're going to fall into our hands because we're going to, in a war of position at the cultural and population and economic level, and we're going to bring these regimes to their knees. So they see that about Israel. The writing on the wall that Jews will not be able to sustain this infrastructure over generations in this region. So they're perfectly ready to accept, as part of that long drawn-out phase, a two-state solution, quote unquote.
Yes.
You concluded with the statement.
Do you want to say your name and who you are? So,
I'm sorry. My name is Manar, and I'm a second-year master's student. And I'm just wondering that you ended up summed up your argument by stating that Israel has two choices: either to die with its enemies or to leave.
If it doesn't strike a bargain.
And I would like actually, I'm an optimistic, and just let me put this out there. And I was wondering, do you have any recommendations for Israel, whatever Israel would be, to transform this relationship from dying with its enemy, but either rising with its friends or living with its friends in the region, whether it's the Palestinians or whether in the Arab countries around? And what would your recommendation would be for the Israelis? Do they have to give up, for example, their Jewish nature of having a Jewish state? Or what I would like to hear more.
Before I say what I think I would advise them to do, which doesn't make much difference, let me trace a possible trajectory that has the force of inertia behind it. That if what I'm saying has some validity, then the part of the Israeli population that's ready to follow the advice I would give them, namely, recognize that the Palestinians are suffering, recognize that the rights that you demand for Jews have to be awarded to Palestinians, recognize that the entire world is not going to accept Israel the way it is, recognize that there's a contradiction between a Jewish state principle and democracy, recognize that the settlements are illegal, immoral, and impossible to think of as consistent with a settlement of the conflict. Realize that some kind of a right of return, however symbolic, has got to be part of it. Yeah, all the people who would be listening to that are leaving, or are those who will be most likely to leave. Meaning that the political forces will go more and more to those who are unwilling to listen to whatever advice you and I might give them. Who are they? The religious, the ultra-Orthodox in particular, African and Asian Jews, Mizrahim, the Arabs, and the Russians or the relatively unskilled part of the new immigrant population. So eventually, it is possible that they will see in themselves an opportunity to say, we're stuck here in the Middle East. Maybe there are cultural resources in our repertoires. I mean, in the past, the ultra-Orthodox have lived nicely with the Arabs. And it's also true of most of the Jewish populations in Israel that came from Arab countries. I mean, their ancestors at least lived nicely. So you can generate cultural and political opportunities if the circumstances are right that force people to find them. But between here and there is a lot of struggle. But my main point is, yes, we can come up with all the conventional wisdom, and we've been offering for years. Part of it is the United States will or must live up to its responsibilities. My own view is that's the crucial thing, because you can't depend on the Israeli left, not because of anything that's wrong with it. It's heroic. It has been heroic. I have published the following brutal metaphor, and I'll say it again, that the United States treats Israel like a drug addict. That we say they're our friend. We say everybody knows you need treatment. And when you go to get treatment, we'll be there with lots of money and lots of jobs and social support, but you're a big adult, we can't force you to get treatment. You've got to do it yourself. You've got to make that decision. Now, while you're deciding whether to get treatment, we'll be putting $10,000 in your bank account every month. That's what the United States does. No drug addict could ever break a habit if it was subsidized like that. So the Israeli democracy has been wrapped in a cocoon that prevents it systematically from understanding the catastrophic nature of the decisions it makes because of that cocoon. That cocoon is wrapped by narrow political interests inside the United States, by people, including American Jews, who think that they're helping the country. They're really destroying it.
Did you say you published that?
Yes, that's in an article in the Tikkun a while back called "In Blood and Fire May Peace Arise."
What year?
It was 2001, something like that. 2002. It's up on my website.
Very powerful
Yeah.
metaphor. Sam?
Would you consider the 2006...
Sam is one of our esteemed doctoral students here.
Pristine.
Esteemed, not pristine.
I said esteemed.
I was actually in Lebanon for the first 10 days of the summer war, 2006. And I'm wondering, on the basis of your analysis, do you think that that particular war and its consequences was effectively the tipping point or the turning point into the Israeli consciousness thinking that we can no longer think about annihilating our neighbors, and that the future needs to look like something different?
No.
Because the impression on the other side is, Hezbollah seems to have forgotten everything else in relation to war between Arabs and the Israelis. And for them, I think maybe 1973 was just as much a loss as the Israelis would think. And that was truly the glorious moment of the Arab Muslim world, then overcoming this powerful machine just by not dying, just by surviving. Where does the future then go from here? I know there are the two scenarios, but I'm also thinking about the more perhaps realistic but not very nice scenario that is we're just going to have to hang out here, and it's going to be tense for 50 or 100 years if we're not going to die with the enemies, and if we're not going to leave. Is the 2006 war effectively the end of that kind of myth?
I thought I understood the question first, and then it seemed like you were asking a couple others. But the one that I think I'm hearing most insistently is whether the resistance, the effective resistance, defeat, neutralization of the Israeli attack in 2006 finally wiped away from Israelis the idea that they could by force get rid of the Arab problem. Is that? And I think no, they had already come to that conclusion. For me, the Lebanon War is emblematic of what had already become true in the Al-Aqsa Intifada, of a non-rational use of force. That you'd already come to believe that force wasn't going to solve anything, but that doesn't mean you don't use it. So that it was just it's emblematic of that ratinade rat hunt. The same thing is associated with the the liquidation of militants or leaders. The same idea. You don't do. In fact, usually they were liquidated at a time when it would interfere with a peace process. It wasn't done as part of a way to facilitate a peace process. So now, I can also say that although in the 80s there was considerable belief in Israel that it would be possible to expel the Arabs and that they would leave the country. I'm not talking about the whole Middle East, but that they would leave. By the 90s, after the first Intifada, and especially the left and the army standing up to Shamir and saying, we are not going to do what you want, which is to treat this as a genocidal war. We are going to fight it to a non-conclusion so that a political settlement can be achieved. Once that occurred, the idea that the Jewish state would be able to get rid of the Arabs by force disappeared. You really don't, even on the extreme right, they don't think that's possible. Instead, insofar as they talk about transfer anymore, they talk about it as an agreement in which Egypt will see the light and realize that its own long-run interests are served by the transfer of all refugees into the Sinai. So I don't think there was. I think the Lebanon War has a different meaning. That's why I pointed out that the Vinograd Commission didn't decide, wow, we have learned a lesson by this war. Instead, they said this war had no purpose, and that's right. They seem to say it as if it should have had a purpose. The deeper reality is that Israel can't give wars like that a purpose because there's a fundamental abandonment of the idea that the Middle East is tractable to Zionist policy. And they haven't abandoned the basic Zionist commitment to a Jewish state which requires such a policy.
Andrea Bartoli, hi, here, Riker. I'm fascinated by the presentation. I must admit that it's unsettling in many ways. I have a few observations. One, that South Africa is actually happily in a new season. And the white minority that 300 years before came to that country is actually very much in power, even though politically is clearly not running the country, saved by an African leadership that was able to imagine a country in which there was room for both. So in a way, if we could elaborate on your model, we could say that a two-state solution could actually work well for Israel because it would give Israel back its own identity in a curious way.
Look, this is the staple argument of the left. This is what Burg actually says. He says that I mean, one of the things he says in a book is that the romance, the eschatology, the fantasies of the right are ultimately meaningless no matter what they do in the territories, no matter how many settlements there are, because the one reality is the green line that will never disappear, and that's the real Israel. And every speech by a left-wing leader, a Peace Now leader, that's the main message, that Israel must return to the real nice Israel before 67, you know. I'm losing my ability to think that that's realistic because I can no longer depend on even really think that the United States is going to ever do what it should or can. The only line that that I can see, the only way in which I see that coming is possibly and I don't say this just because I support Barack Obama, but if you have a president whose support is not based narrowly on lobbies, especially, but on a diffuse charismatic support, then there's more degrees of freedom. But that's not the only thing. The main thing is getting out of Iraq. If the American people can be convinced that getting out of Iraq with as small a catastrophe as possible is a vital American national interest, and that part of that is dealing with the Arab-Israeli question, and that's the way that could be done. I started saying that when the war broke out. You know, it's an ill wind that blows no good. I've been totally opposed to this war from when it was first even imagined by those who architected it. But I always have said that the one good thing that could have come out of it is if we go in, when we come out, we may have to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict in order to get out. But usually such rational things don't happen.
Anyway, I was keep thinking that the other consequence is in a way that rather than Samson and Jeremiah, the curious outcome could actually be the second phase of the Iron Wall, the actual moment in which you do recognize that there is a mutuality of recognition, and that unless Israel has that recognition, that never had, there is no viability. But what if the Arab world, for political calculation, because of Iran, because of other things, would actually start saying, you know what, it's good for us to have Israel nearby. And it would be a good, interesting...
More than the Saudi initiative, the Arab League position, we'll have a peace treaty with you, fine, just go back to the 67 borders. More than that? Israel is doing something now which I think you need to deal with from that question. Part of Zionism, part of the Iron Wall was always, we do not demand of the Palestinians that they say that we are right. We only demand that they accept our reality. From their point of view, we are wrong. And we are not demanding that they say that we have a right to exist, only that they accept it as inevitable. What has happened in connection with the abandonment of the Iron Wall is an abandonment of that line. And now you hear from Tzipi Livni, you hear from Sharon, you hear from Olmert, the Arabs must agree and accept not to Israel's existence, but to the right to Israel exist as a Jewish state. Zionism has never demanded that. This is a complete contradiction to the Iron Wall. And that's more evidence for my argument. Because once you have abandoned the Iron Wall, you abandon the idea of making peace through force, then you might as well enjoy the political sensation and benefits of out-demanding your opponent for what the Arabs have to do, because they're never going to do anything anyway.
The last point was that in many ways Israel was...
So what I was asking, do you think the Arabs should recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish Zionist state?
No, this is why I'm going back to the Iron Wall and saying, well, actually, there is an interesting point in saying that you should not over-condition the negotiation. So I think that I'm back to your point at the beginning. But the other thing is that Israel has a dream. You spoke a lot about fantasies and people leaving, and the villa in the villa, and the villa in the jungle, and people living in Silicon Valley and living in this branding world and so on. But wouldn't you agree that in many ways all our political activities are a little bit dreaming?
I am a Gramscian, so I believe that every political institution that works well is a fantasy that's been concretized. Now, it doesn't usually live out the fantasy, but without it, you wouldn't have gotten it to begin with. You also can't break an institution or without a counter fantasy. So I don't, there's a reason I talk about it. I think that they play crucial roles, but it's also when only at a certain stage that the fantasy as fantasy plays a role, as opposed to as a mobilizational tool in a real political struggle that has good prospects.
I want to ask a question if nobody... one short question.
Nadim, can you take the mic?
One short question, and then I want to see in response to your answer, Sam. In your paper, and you mentioned that here, that Israel is now demanding the world and the Palestinians and the Arab world to recognize it as a Jewish state. And Sam is helping me looking into the internal Israeli discourse and the diplomatic discourse into this. I wonder why Israel is doing this now and what your thoughts are about it. I mean, you present it as a sign that this is an abandonment of the Iron Wall, because the Iron Wall, as you said, is founded on force. But
my question, pedagogical use of force.
Yeah. Now, my question is the following. In answer to Sam, you said that the war in Lebanon showed the Israelis that the use of force cannot solve their problems with the Arabs, with the Palestinians, and you said that, during the first Intifada, the left stood up to Shamir and so on. Can I put a counter argument that is based. Actually, if I agree with your analysis about the abandonment of the Iron Wall, well, you agree that out of that use of force pedagogically, there's still the use of force. I think the use of force was part of the Zionist idea anyway. There is no way of conceiving of a Jewish state without the use of force, and there's no way of continuing it without the use of force, whether pedagogically or not. Now, with what's happening now, is it possible that the use of force can escalate into levels of mass crimes, of crimes against humanity? I mean, what happened in Gaza and has been justified, the justificatory system within Israeli society is also changing. They are justifying what they are doing in Gaza. The Supreme Court, if you look, I mean, one fascinating reading of the Supreme Court dealing with the issue was that the Supreme Court is saying, you know what, I don't want to deal with the issue at all. I don't want to deal with it based on international law at all. I want to deal with it based on what the Israeli society's values are. So the Israeli society's values are changing. There's the use of force, there's the escalation, and it's possible that if these dynamics continue, that Israel actually will use more of that. And in that case, if dynamics evolve to expulsion, mass expulsion of mass crimes, that would be possible. The point is that it's much more possible now than in the past.
I agree. I completely agree that when Zionism cultivated the principle of the purity of arms, Torah Neshek, so Jewish arms were only going to be used absolutely necessary with a minimum amount of bloodshed, and it was never going to be glorified for its own sake. Well, this was a nice idea. It generally did not get implemented, but it was developed and fostered explicitly because there was always the sense that you would poison the well if you developed. The well was the eventual availability of peace with the people you were fighting. If you abandon that image, as I'm suggesting is part of the abandonment of the Iron Wall, then you have no restraint ultimately on what you can do with force. None.
Right.
And so the idea of more massive crimes becomes it becomes more available. And when you look at Samson, people don't think about it this way, but Samson was the first suicide bomber, except that he did it in a place of worship. True, he'd been waterboarded or worse, but he had been arrested and imprisoned as a nationalist firebrand who'd been setting fires, arson. I mean, he'd been setting fields afire by tying torches to the tails of foxes and sending them through the fields of the Philistines, who he considered had been illegally settling the Israelites' land. So he killed thousands of people in a place of their worship. Actually, the rabbis aren't too thrilled with Samson, to tell you the truth. He's a problematic figure in Jewish history, but not so much because of that. But my point is that exactly what you're saying, that once you remove the pedagogical aspect of the use of force and it becomes a non-rational activity, that removes a massive limit on it, an internal limit. I completely agree.
This is amazing. I mean, when Jabotinsky becomes the last...
The
moderate.
What's the
The
term?
moderate,
The last war, the last...
line of defense.
Right. It's against...
What's so interesting also...
And about the Jewish state, I'm sorry, about the Jewish state, if you don't mind. Why is that emerging now?
Oh, yes.
Recognition of the
I tried to say why I think that's happening. I think it's happening, and there are two minds of it. I have seen signs that there's a dispute of sort between Olmert and Libna. I think Libna takes this line stronger than Olmert does, but Olmert's been on the wagon, on this for a while. I don't think it's a way for the right wing to make, stop the peace process. This is their current. Instead of setting up a new settlement, they say how come they're not agreeing to a Jewish state? It's a way to focus on the right of return issue, try to close that down. There are little tactical reasons why it's coming up because of the influence of the right, but the main reason is because because Zionism has exhausted itself as a guide to policy. Zionist theory and practice is just as Nekudah said. I mean, it's served its historical mission. It's no longer relevant. That's why Israel is fundamentally post-Zionist. It doesn't mean, however, that everybody is a Schenkenite and liberal and wants to. No, post-Zionism can have many forms, including some that are not restrained by the traditional commitments, hopes, aspirations, and programs of Zionism. That's exactly what I'm saying. Now, why they talk about the Jewish state? Again, the cost is low. Since you're not ruling out anything you think could happen by saying it, so why not say it to get support locally? What's the cost of saying it? If you think that there's a promising political avenue ahead, you're not even asking whether there's a promising political avenue. You assume there isn't. All this talk, I mean, give me a break about how we're going to have a Palestinian state in the next year. I mean, what a joke. I have, however, found at least one Palestinian who actually believed that, or said he believed it. I'm not going to even name the person, but the argument was as follows. That
Does the name start with K? Anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yes. I guess there's only one. All right, so the idea is this government it knows that it's not able to bring a deal to fruition, but that's not what it agreed to. It can come to a deal, and then its only hope of winning an election is to get the Israeli electorate excited enough about actually having a peace deal in its hands to go to new elections after they sign the deal. And that's why they may sign it. You've heard that argument.
Okay. Sarah, and then we will...
Sure.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment about the relationship. I've been very interested in the lecture.
You've been taking notes.
Furiously. I've been very interested in the relationship between your lecture and narrative.
Yep.
Because basically, one other way to say what you've said tonight is there was a story launched by that theorist that in fact is no longer applicable. And outside of any narrative framework, people have no understanding of the future, they don't have a story to tell, and they have no way of containing, Nadim, the violence. And basically I was going to make the point you were making, which is that narrative, the only way to contain violence is through narrative. You have to have a story about why we're doing this. And if that ceases to be connected to any foundation, it marauds and is potentially genocidal. So I just wanted to say, from a narrative perspective, it's a very interesting topic.
One of the things I would, if I had the time, what I would commission one of your students to do a study of contemporary Israeli literature and poetry for images of the future, narratives of the future. Because I suspect that in fact I know that if you look at South African literature in the decade before the end of apartheid, or the move toward the end of apartheid, you would find a certain change toward the South African narrative that was implicit in the poetry this is a project which I just don't have time or even the skills to pursue, but I believe that that's one of the places I want to see pointing to the political horizon.
Very interesting.
So you're saying that in South Africa, unlike in Israel, there were positive...
I'm not saying unlike in Israel. I haven't read enough contemporary Israel.
See if in Israel there is.
He's saying this would be an interesting
I suspect.
question.
I know that you will find an abandonment of the traditional narrative. The question is whether you will find a new one. According to my theory, you won't.
Yeah, and if there's any place to find it, it's really in the arts, in the literature, movies, and so on. Dean?
I wanted to come back to my original question, but in South Africa, you begin to find by 1985 white businessmen going to talk to the leaders in exile and discovering that they're not that dangerous, and coming back and lots of people buying into it. I'm sure the narrative began to change around
Right.
it. But let me come back to my original question, because so much of the American analysis, so much of the Israeli analysis is, I think, predicated on the assumption that you've got a hard core in Hamas and related groups that finally would not make it possible to have a two-state solution. And you're arguing that it is possible now. It won't last, and so on, but that it is possible now. What is your evidence that Hamas would accept it?
All right. I'm not going to give you evidence of that. I'm going to, but I am going to argue a principle with you. That to pose about this protracted conflict, or any protracted conflict, or actually any difficult problem at all, that there is a solution, or what is the solution, this is the wrong question to ask. Whether the question is not what is the solution to the problem, but how could we get a preferable problem?
Absolutely.
Now, whether that's your own personal life, or it's your work environment, or your research task, or settling the Irish dispute, or the Israeli-Arab dispute, you're never going to solve it. The question is whether what you do will bring you a better set of problems than the one you got. So I would rather have a set of problems that included continued Arab-Israeli demands for equal rights, because the principle of a Jewish state is still in force, disputes among Hamas about exactly how long the ceasefire ought to last. I would love to have those problems rather than the problems of spasmodic war unleashed on different parts of the Middle East by Israel, which is what I think we've got instead, and Arab reactions. So it's not, why do I think that that's going to work as a solution? I don't have to prove that to you. All I have to prove is it's a way to a better set of problems.
I'm sure if it would. I agree. Yeah.
Well,
I think we ought to try explore it, for sure. Absolutely.
Well, we want to thank Ian very much for, again, wonderful, stimulating presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadeem. Thank you.